Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to the webinar. We're delighted to have you join us today for Know Before You Go, International Expansion Best Practices. My name is Ed Burke. I'm Marketing Programs Manager for High Street Partners, and I will be moderator for today's webinar. Before I introduce our panelist, I would like to quickly give you some insight on how High Street Partners is positioned to speak as experts on today's subject. HSP is the leader in international business services and software. We manage international operations for customers that are either expanding overseas or who are already operating overseas, including payroll, bookkeeping, local tax filings, legal compliance, cash, and expense management. We do this today for 600 customers in over 110 countries via our products and services: HSP Overseas Direct, HSP Overseas Advisory, and our integrated cloud-based HSP Overseas Connect platform. HSP has a solution that fits your business's needs. Now I'd like to introduce our panelist for today's broadcast, Scott Altsworth. Scott has more than 2 decades of experience in international business and finance. Scott is HSP's Vice President of Sales and helps companies achieve organizational objectives through international expansion. Scott's extensive background includes working in various finance and operations roles at 4 venture-backed startups. Scott also worked as Vice President of Mergers and Acquisitions at Interliant, where he completed 28 acquisitions in just 3 years, and helped get the company to its initial public offering. Prior to that, Scott held roles in finance and operations in several venture-backed companies. Earlier in his career, Scott was Senior Director at Unify Communications, where he negotiated contracts and managed international compliance requirements with telecommunications vendors and carriers in 30 countries. Over to you, Scott.
Thanks, Ed. Taking a look at the agenda for today. So we'll talk about some common expansion scenarios. We will review the key concept of permanent establishment, sometimes also referred to as PE. We'll review human resources questions, talk about some expats and how to deal with them when expanding globally. Lastly, we'll review our top 10 practices to follow when expanding overseas, and then we'll wrap up with your questions. Next. So a common scenario. The VP of Sales walks into the head of HR's office with 2 signed offer letters for people in France, or maybe it's Brazil or Zimbabwe or somewhere else in the world. Unfortunately, the company doesn't have an entity in that country, so let's say in France. Next step is, what do I do? Typically, a company will evaluate, do they need to set up an entity in country, and what type of entity would be appropriate? What are their options? Are they contractors? Do they have to be employees? What type of employment contracts may be required? What do I need to do locally to be compliant in that country? And then what am I going to do if I'm sending expats overseas? Next. So the key concept is permanent establishment. Really, do we need an entity in country? Whether or not a company has PE in that country is typically determined by what are their activities, and really, are they generating revenue in that country? Are the local tax authorities going to assess tax on that revenue? The definition of permanent establishment really can vary by country to country, and you should really do research before moving in and determining what the next steps are. There are some key items to consider. Number 1, are you operating out of a fixed place of business? Right? Meaning, do you have an office? Do your employees or contractors, do they have business cards? If you have sales employees, are they getting commissions or bonuses? Are they receiving stock options? We'll look at specific job titles. If you have a managing director of Europe, then that's a key indicator as to the activities on the ground and what the individuals are doing there. Are sales made to customers? Are you generating revenue in country? And it may not just be locally, right, but as the U.S. parent, are they generating revenue in country? These are all key items to consider when you set up and operate in country.